Hello again, and we are reading The Mortification of Sin by John Owen. We're in chapter 12. Number 8, exercise yourself to meditate upon God. The 8th preparatory direction for overcoming sin is to practice and engage in meditations that fill you with self-abasement and thoughts of your own unworthiness at all times. Such meditations include A. The excellence and majesty of God. Think often about the excellence of God's majesty and your own infinite, inconceivable distance from Him. Many thoughts like this will fill you with a sense of your own unworthiness, which strikes deep at the root of any indwelling sin. When Job comes to a clear discovery of God's greatness and excellence, he is filled with self-loathing and humility. Job 42:5 and 6. In what state does the prophet Habakkuk find himself upon realizing the majesty of God? Habakkuk 3:16. With God, says Job, is terrible majesty. Job 37:22. Hence people in the past thought that when they saw God, they would die. The scripture is full of self-abasing considerations, comparing people to grasshoppers, vanity, and dust of the balance in relation to God. Isaiah 40:12-25. Think often about these ideas to humble your heart and keep your soul humble within you. Nothing will make you less likely to be deceived by sin than such a mindset. Think greatly of God's greatness. B. Your unfamiliarity with God. Think often about how little you know God. Although you know enough to stay humble, you still know so little of Him. This contemplation led the wise man to realize his own ignorance. Surely I am more brutish than any man, and I have not the understanding of a man. I neither learned wisdom, nor I have the knowledge of the holy. Who has descended up into heaven, or descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has bound the waters in his garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is his son's name, if thou can tell? Proverbs 30:2-4. Work with this idea to lower the pride of your heart. What do you know of God? How little a portion it is. How immense He is in His nature. Can you look without terror into the abyss of eternity? You cannot bear the rays of His glorious being. C. Men of high attainment yet know little of God. To keep your heart in constant awe of God's majesty, consider that even those with the highest achievements and the closest communion with God still know very little of Him and His glory in this life. God reveals His name to Moses, the most glorious attributes He has shown in the covenant of grace: merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth, Exodus 34:5 and 7. Yet all these are just the back parts of God, Exodus 33:23. All that Moses knows by this is small and low compared to God's perfect glory. That's why it said, no man has seen God at any time, John 1:18, especially in comparison with Christ, John 1:17. We talk a lot about God, His ways, His works, His plans all day long. But the truth is, we know very little of Him. Our thoughts, meditations, and expressions about Him are low, many of them unworthy of His glory, and none of them reach His perfection. 1. Objection. Moses was under the law. You might argue that Moses was under the law when God hid Himself in darkness and used symbols, clouds, and mysterious practices. However, now, under the bright light of the gospel, which has brought life and immortality to light, revealing God from His own essence, we know Him much more clearly and as He truly is. We see His face now, not just His back parts like Moses did. Answer 1. I agree that there is a huge and almost unimaginable difference between our understanding of God now, after He has spoken to us through His own Son, and the understanding that most saints had under the law. Even though their eyes were as good as ours, their faith and spiritual understanding were not inferior to ours, and the object was as glorious for them as it is for us. Our day is clearer than theirs. The clouds have been dispersed, Song of Solomon 4:6. The shadows of the night have disappeared, the sun has risen, and the means of sight have become more prominent and clear than before. 2. Despite this, the unique vision that Moses had of God was a gospel vision, a view of God as gracious, etc., and yet it is called only his back parts, meaning it was relatively low and common compared to his excellencies and perfections. 3. The apostle greatly emphasizes the glory of light above that of the law, clarifying now the veil causing darkness has been removed, 2 Corinthians 3:15, so that we all, with open or uncovered faces, are beholding the glory of the Lord, 3:18. He also explains how, as in a glass. In a glass, how is that? Clearly? Perfectly? Unfortunately, no. He tells you how that is. We see through a glass darkly, 1 Corinthians 13:12. It is not a telescope which helps us see distant things that the apostle is talking about. And yet, even with their help, how far short do we fall of the truth of things? It is a mirror to which he refers, where only vague forms and images of things are seen, not the things themselves. He compares our knowledge to a sight in such a mirror. 2. We see but little. He also tells you that all we do see through this glass is in darkness and obscurity, like a riddle. And speaking of himself, who was certainly much more clear-sighted than anyone alive today, he says he saw only in part. He saw just the back parts of the heavenly things, 1 Corinthians 13:12, and compares all the knowledge he had of God to what he knew when he was a child. It is only a part, short of that which is perfect, and will eventually be done away or destroyed. We know how weak, feeble, and uncertain children's notions and perceptions of abstract things are, how when they grow up with proper education, those incomplete ideas vanish, and they become embarrassed by them. It is commendable for a child to love, honor, believe, and obey their father, but the father knows the child's childishness and foolishness in knowledge and thoughts. Despite our confidence in high achievements, all our ideas of God are childish compared to his infinite perfections. We stammer and babble, and we don't really know what we're saying for the most part in our most precise conceptions and notions of God as we think. We can love, honor, believe, and obey our Father, and he accepts our childish thoughts because they are just that, childish. We see only his back parts. We know very little about him. That is why we often find comfort and support in the promise, we shall see him as he is, 1 John 3:2. We shall see him face to face, and know even as also we are known, meaning we will comprehend that for which we are comprehended, 1 Corinthians 13:12. And positively, now we see him not, 1 Peter 1:8. All of this means that here we see only his back parts, not as he is, but in a dark, obscure representation, not in the perfection of his glory. The Queen of Sheba had heard much about Solomon and had formed many great thoughts about his magnificence in her mind. But when she came and saw his glory, she had to admit that not even half the truth had been told to her. 1 Kings 10:1-7. We may think that we have achieved great knowledge and clear, high thoughts of God here, but when he brings us into his presence, we will exclaim, we never knew him as he is. Even 1,000th part of his glory, perfection, and blessedness never entered our hearts. D. Our unfamiliarity with our end. The apostle tells us in 1 John 3:2 that we don't know what we ourselves will be, what we find ourselves to be in the end. Even less can we conceive what God is and what we will find him to be. Consider either him who is to be known or the way by which we know him, and this will become more evident. 1. Consider God who is to be known. We know so little of God because it is God who is to be known. That is, he has described himself to us mainly by this, that we cannot know him. What else does he mean when he calls himself invisible, incomprehensible, and the like? That is, he whom we do not and cannot know as he is. Our further progress consists more in knowing what he is not than what he is. Thus he is described as immortal and infinite. He is not like us, mortal, infinite, and limited. This is why there is such a glorious description of him, who only has immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, whom no man has seen, nor can see. 1 Timothy 6:16. His light is such that no creature can approach it. He is not seen, not because he cannot be seen, but because we cannot bear the sight of him. The light of God, in whom there is no darkness, prevents any access to him by any creature whatsoever. We who cannot even look at the sun in its glory are too weak to withstand the beams of infinite brightness. Considering this, the wise man confesses himself a mere beast who does not have the understanding of a man. Proverbs 32. He knew nothing compared to God, so it seemed as if he had lost all understanding when he began to consider God, his work, and his ways. In this consideration, let our souls delve into some specifics. A. The very being of God. We need to understand God's being in order to teach each other about it through words and expressions. However, our understanding of God's actual being is so limited that trying to form any mental image of it, as we do with other things, is like creating an idol for ourselves. In doing so, we would be worshiping a God of our own making, rather than the God who created us. The best we can do in terms of understanding God's being is to realize that we cannot truly comprehend it. Our knowledge is quite limited when all we know is that we don't know. B. What God has declared. There are some things about God that he has taught us to speak about and express. Yet even when we do so, we still don't truly see or understand those things. All we can do is believe and admire. We are taught to say that God is infinite, omnipotent, and eternal, and we have some ideas about concepts like omnipresence, immensity, infiniteness, and eternity. But when it comes to truly understanding these things, our minds can only grasp so much before becoming overwhelmed. Our understanding is limited, and the best we can do is accept that we don't understand and find peace in that. We can only catch a glimpse of the vastness of eternity and infiniteness. And what about the Trinity, or the idea of distinct persons existing within the same essence? It's a mystery that many people deny simply because no one can truly understand it. The immense distance between God and us keeps us from clearly understanding his perfections. We know him more through his actions than through his essence, and even then, we only discover a small portion of him. Job 26:14. 2. The way we should know God. Our knowledge of God is limited because it is primarily through faith that we know him. I won't discuss the natural belief in God that exists in all people, or what they can learn about God from observing his creation and providence. It is clear that such knowledge is weak, limited, and confusing. No one has ever truly glorified God based on that knowledge alone, and despite knowing about God, they remain without God in the world. Ephesians 2:12. Our main connection with God and understanding of his nature comes through faith. He who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Hebrews 11:6. Our knowledge of God and his rewards, which also form the basis of our obedience, comes through faith. We walk by faith, not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5:7. By faith we believe in things that we cannot see or fully understand. Hebrews 11:1. Objection. Christ reveals himself to believers. You might argue that this limited understanding only applies to those who don't know God as revealed in Christ Jesus. For those who know Christ, things are different. It's true that no one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten Son, he has declared or revealed him. John 1:18. And the Son of God has come and has given us an understanding that we may know him who is true. 1 John 5:20. The light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, shines upon believers. 2 Corinthians 4:4. God has shined in our hearts to give us the knowledge of his glory in the face of Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians 4:6. So although we were once in darkness, we are now light in the Lord. Ephesians 5:8. We can now behold the glory of the Lord with unveiled faces. 2 Corinthians 3:18. Our communication and fellowship are with the Father and His Son. 1 John 1:3. The light of the gospel which reveals God is glorious. It's not just a star, but the sun in its full beauty that has risen upon us, and the veil has been removed from our faces. So while unbelievers and perhaps some weak believers may still be in darkness, those with stronger faith and growth have a clearer view of the face of God in Jesus Christ. To which I answer the following. 1. The truth is, we all know enough about God to love Him more than we do, to delight in Him, serve Him, believe in Him, obey Him, and trust Him more than we have so far. Our lack of understanding and weakness is no excuse for our negligence and disobedience. Who among us has truly lived according to the knowledge we have of God's perfection, excellence, and will? God's purpose in giving us any knowledge of Himself is for us to glorify Him as God, to love Him, serve Him, believe and obey Him, and give Him all the honor and glory that is due from us as sinful creatures, to a forgiving God and Creator. We must all admit that we have never fully transformed ourselves into the image of the knowledge we have had. And if we had used our talents well, we might have been trusted with more. 2. Comparatively, the knowledge we have of God through the revelation of Jesus Christ in the gospel is extremely imminent and glorious. It is so when compared to any other knowledge of God that might be attained, or that was delivered in the law under the Old Testament, which are only a shadow of good things, not the exact image of them. The apostle discusses this at length in 2 Corinthians 3:6. Christ has now, in these last days, revealed the Father from His own heart, declared His name, and made known His mind, will, and counsel, in a much clearer, eminent, and distinct way than He did before when He kept His people under the guidance of the law. This is what is mainly intended in the mentioned passages. The clear delivery and declaration of God and His will in the gospel is expressly exalted in comparison to any other way of revelation of Himself. 3. The difference between believers and unbelievers in terms of knowledge is not so much in the content of their knowledge, but in the way they know. Some unbelievers may know more and be able to say more about God, His perfections, and His will than many believers. But they know nothing as they should, nothing in the right way, nothing spiritually and savingly, nothing with a holy, heavenly light. The excellence of a believer is not that they have a vast understanding of these things, but what they do understand, which may be very little, they see in the light of the Spirit of God, in a soul-saving, transforming light. This is what gives us communion with God, not curious thoughts or inquisitive, elevated notions. 4. Jesus Christ, through His Word and Spirit, reveals to the hearts of all His people God as Father, as a God in covenant, as a rewarder. He does this in every way sufficiently to teach us to obey Him here, and to lead us to His heart, to rest there in the enjoyment of Him for eternity. But even so, 5. Despite all this, we only know a small portion of Him. We only see His back parts. This is because of the following. First, the intention of all gospel revelation is not to unveil God's essential glory so that we should see Him as He is, but to merely declare enough of Him as He knows to be sufficient to be a foundation for our faith, love, obedience, and coming to Him. That is, of the faith that He expects from us here, and of such services as suitable to poor creatures in the midst of temptations. But when He calls us to eternal admiration and contemplation without interruption, that is, heaven, He will make a new kind of discovery of Himself. Then the whole shape of things as it now appears before us will vanish like a shadow. Secondly, we are dull and slow of heart to receive the things that are revealed in the Word. God, through our weakness and infirmity, keeps us in constant dependence upon Him for teachings and revelations of Himself from His Word, never in this world bringing any soul to the utmost of what can be discovered and understood from the Word. Therefore, although the way of revelation in the gospel is clear and evident, we still know little of the things themselves that are revealed. Let us then revive the use and intention of this consideration. Won't a proper understanding of God's inconceivable greatness and the infinite distance at which we stand from Him fill our souls with a holy and awe-filled fear of Him, so as to keep us in a state that is unsuitable for the growth or flourishing of any lust? Let our souls be continually accustomed to reverential thoughts of God's greatness and omnipresence, and we will be much more watchful of any improper behavior. Consider Him with whom we have to do. Even our God is a consuming fire, Hebrews 4:13 and 12:29. In your greatest humiliations in His presence and under His gaze, know that your very nature is too limited to bear thoughts suitable to His essential glory.